He had survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 federal investigations, and a war that left 7 men dead in a single night. Rafael De Luca had never lost. Not once. Not to a rival, not to a judge, not to anyone who dared stand in the path of the most dangerous man on the East Coast. But on a Tuesday night in October, with his captain seated around a mahogany table and a glass of bourbon half finished in his hand, Rafael De Luca lost to something he never saw coming: his own heart. If this story finds you wherever you are in the world, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me until the very end, because this one is going to cost you sleep. 7. The bourbon was a 22-year Pappy Van Winkle, poured 2 fingers deep, and Raphael hadn't touched it in 40 minutes. That alone should have told the men in the room something was wrong. 7 of his captains sat around the long mahogany table on the 43rd floor of De Luca Tower, a building that bore his family name on its glass facade and his father's sins in every beam of its foundation. The Manhattan skyline pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows like a painting nobody asked for. Below, the city moved the way it always moved, loud, indifferent, unaware that the man who quietly controlled 3 of its largest port operations and 2 of its most powerful labor unions was sitting perfectly still in a leather chair and sweating through a shirt that cost more than most people's car payments. Marco Vitelli was talking. He was always talking. 38 years old, the kind of jaw that made juries doubt guilty verdicts, and the particular talent of filling a room with words that meant very little while sounding like they meant everything. He was explaining a problem with the Harlem distribution corridor. A supplier had gone quiet, a mid-level operator named Denny Reese had started skimming, and there was a question of whether the response should be surgical or loud. Raphael already knew the answer. He'd known it before Marco opened his mouth, but he couldn't say it. Something was sitting on his chest. That was the only way to describe it. Like someone had placed a flat stone there, nothing dramatic, nothing sharp, just weight, pressure. A slow, grinding heaviness that had started somewhere around his left shoulder and was now spreading with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world. He shifted in the chair. Marco kept talking. The pressure moved. Raphael picked up the bourbon glass, not to drink it, just to give his hand something to do, and that was when his fingers didn't cooperate the way they were supposed to. The glass tilted, caught himself. Set it down too hard, and the sound cut through Marco's sentence like a blade. Every man at the table looked at him. 7 pairs of eyes. 7 men who had spent years learning to read Rafael De Luca's silences the way sailors read weather. None of them spoke. That was the nature of the room. You waited. You did not ask. You certainly did not say what you were all thinking, which was that the boss's face had gone a color it had no business being. "Keep going," Raphael said. His voice came out level. That was the part that would haunt him later. How level his voice was, right up until the moment it stopped working entirely. Marco hesitated, then kept going. The stone on Raphael's chest got heavier. It moved from pressure into something that had teeth. A grinding, twisting thing that climbed up through his sternum and began pulling at his jaw, his left arm, the tendons behind his ear. He had been shot before, twice. One clean through the side, one that took 3 surgeons and a blood transfusion to correct. And this was nothing like that. Getting shot was fast and bright and obvious. This was slow and deliberate and quiet, and somehow that made it worse, because Rafael De Luca had spent 32 years being very good at ignoring quiet things. He stood up. The room stopped. "Boss?" That was Caruso, the youngest captain at the table, 26 years old and still with enough instinct to know when something was genuinely wrong versus when it was theater. The word came out careful and tight. Raphael put one hand on the table. Just for a second, just to feel something solid. "Finish without me," he said. He made it 4 steps toward the door. The 4th step went sideways in a way steps weren't supposed to, and the stone on his chest stopped being a stone and became something else entirely, something enormous and hot and consuming. And Rafael De Luca, who had never in 32 years shown weakness in front of his men, who had sat through a gunshot wound with his jaw locked and his eyes dry, who had buried his best friend at age 19 and delivered the eulogy without his voice cracking once, went down to one knee on the carpet of his own conference room like someone had cut a wire. The room exploded. Caruso was on his feet first. Marco knocked over his chair getting around the table. Someone was already on a phone, and someone else was saying words that Raphael could hear but couldn't quite assemble into meaning. The carpet was dark gray and very clean, and Raphael found himself studying the weave of it, which was an odd thing to focus on, but focus had become difficult, and the weave was there, and it was something. "Don't call a hospital," he said, or he thought he said it. He wasn't entirely sure the words left his mouth. "Boss, stop talking." That was Caruso, right next to him now, one hand on his back. And it was strange. Raphael noticed this distantly. The way you notice things when your body is doing something catastrophic and your mind retreats to the small details. It was strange that he didn't shove the hand away. He always shoved hands away. He had spent his entire life structuring the world so that nobody touched him without permission, and permission was almost never granted. He didn't shove the hand away. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. Raphael spent those 11 minutes on the carpet of his conference room floor, and he would never tell another living soul what he thought about during those 11 minutes. But it is worth saying that he did not think about the empire. He did not think about the ports, the unions, the distribution corridor, Denny Reese, or the 14 active federal monitoring orders bearing his name. He did not think about his father or his captains, or the $17 million currently laundered through 3 separate real estate holdings. He thought about the fact that the room smelled faintly like the bourbon he hadn't drunk, and he thought, with a clarity that felt obscene, "I have never once in my life let myself be still." The hospital was Mount Sinai, private wing, 3rd floor, a room that cost $8,000 a day and had a view of Central Park that Raphael would have found insulting under any other circumstances. He woke up 12 hours after the event, myocardial infarction. The cardiologist said it like he was reading off a grocery list, with 2 IVs in his arm, a heart monitor conducting its small, irritating symphony to his left, and his father seated in the chair beside the bed. Vincenzo De Luca was 64 years old and looked like what happened when ambition curdled into something harder. He had the same dark coloring as Raphael, the same heavy jaw, the same quality of absolute stillness when he was thinking. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that he had clearly been wearing for a while. The jacket hung on the back of the chair. The shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows with the mechanical precision of a man who managed everything, including how his grief appeared. He was not grieving, or if he was, it looked identical to how he looked at everything else. "You're awake," Vincenzo said. "Apparently. Doctor says the damage to the cardiac muscle is significant. You're 32 years old." He said it like an accusation, like Raphael's age was a personal failing. "I'm aware of how old I am." "You've been working like your grandfather. He died at 51. Vincenzo paused. "I always thought that was weakness. Now I'm less certain." Raphael looked at the ceiling. It was a very clean ceiling. Hospitals always had very clean ceilings because the ceilings were the thing patients studied when they had nowhere else to put their eyes. "Where's Marco?" "Handling the situation in Harlem. I told him you'd want it quiet." Vincenzo uncrossed his legs and recrossed them. "The doctors want to speak with you about lifestyle modifications." "Their word. Modifications." He said the word like it was faintly ridiculous. "They also strongly recommend a private nurse for the recovery period. Given the nature of our privacy requirements, a hospital placement is not ideal." "I don't need a nurse." "You collapsed in front of 7 captains." "I had a cardiac event." "There's a difference." Vincenzo looked at him with the particular expression Raphael had been trying to decode since childhood, the one that might have been concern, except it always arrived dressed as something colder. "You will hire a nurse," he said, "or I will have one installed. Those are the options." Raphael said nothing. Vincenzo took the silence as agreement, because in 32 years of dealing with his son, he had learned that Raphael's silences carried more information than most men's speeches. He stood, collected his jacket, and moved toward the door with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once in his life questioned whether a room would make way for him. At the door he stopped. "The empire does not survive sentiment," he said, without turning around. "You built it. Don't let recovery make you soft." Then he left, and the room was very quiet except for the heart monitor, which continued its small, persistent work, regardless of what either De Luca man had just decided. Raphael spent 8 days in the hospital. He hated every one of them with the focused intensity he usually reserved for federal prosecutors and men who lied to him about money. The cardiologist's name was Dr. Patricia Owens, and she had the specific energy of a person who had long since stopped being impressed by powerful men and their various attempts to intimidate her out of delivering unwelcome news. She was 50, direct, and had a habit of looking at Raphael like he was a machine she was trying to diagnose, rather than a human being she was trying to manage. Raphael found this, perversely, almost comfortable. "Your lifestyle is the problem," she told him on day 3. "Not just the stress, the diet, the sleep deprivation, the alcohol intake, and the fact that by my estimation you haven't engaged in physical exercise that wasn't violence adjacent in approximately a decade." "I run," he said, "occasionally, under duress." She pulled up something on her tablet. "Your blood pressure on arrival was 210 over 120. That's not stress. That's a building with structural damage that kept being asked to hold more weight than it was designed for. What are you recommending? Medication, dietary changes, a structured recovery program, and genuine rest, which I understand may be a foreign concept." She looked at him over the tablet. "You'll also need support at home for the first 8 to 12 weeks. A private nurse is the most practical option given your circumstances." He didn't ask how she knew about his circumstances. Doctors who worked with men like Raphael had either figured out the nature of their patients' work or been specifically selected not to ask. He suspected Owens was the former, and that she had decided years ago it wasn't her problem. "I want someone quiet," he said. "I'll send you several profiles. Quiet and professional. No conversation beyond what's medically necessary." Dr. Owens wrote something on the tablet. "I'll pass that along." She sent him 4 profiles. He rejected 3 within 2 minutes. The 4th he almost rejected on reflex, then stopped. Her name was Elena Brooks, 29 years old, cardiac care specialist, which was relevant. 5 years at Lenox Hill before private care. Her references were from 3 separate patients, all of them glowing in the precise way that suggested she was genuinely good at her job rather than merely adequate. She had no social media presence that Marco's background sweep could find, no obvious connections to any of the families, and her personal history. The sweep had been thorough, because Raphael did not hire anyone without knowing who they were, included a divorce finalized 2 years prior and a prior address in Raleigh, North Carolina, where she had apparently grown up. There was a photo attached to the profile. Workplace ID slightly overexposed. A young woman with dark hair pulled back from her face, unremarkable in the way that some people are when photographed in fluorescent light, but with something in the set of her expression. Careful, a little guarded, like she was used to being in rooms where she needed to take up as little space as possible. Raphael looked at the photo for approximately 4 seconds longer than was necessary, then approved the hire. "Let's see." She arrived on a Thursday. Raphael was home by then. The penthouse on the top 2 floors of DeLuca Tower, a place designed by an architect who had been briefed to make it feel like power without making it feel like a hotel, and who had mostly succeeded except for the way the ceilings were too high and the furniture was too precise, and the whole space had the quality of a room that was waiting for something to actually happen inside it. He was in the main living area when the elevator opened. He had not been told she would arrive at 11 in the morning. He had been given a window, Thursday morning, and had arranged himself in an armchair with a series of reports. He wasn't reading because the cardiologist had told him screen time needed to be limited, and he had been ignoring that particular instruction for 6 days. He heard the elevator and did not look up. Footsteps. Quiet. Careful. The way people moved in unfamiliar spaces. He heard her stop. He looked up. She was smaller than the photo suggested. That was the first thing. Not short exactly, maybe 5'4" or 5'5", but with a quality of physical quietness, like she had learned to arrange herself to fit whatever space she was in. Dark hair down today, not pulled back. She was wearing navy scrub pants and a soft gray cardigan over a white shirt, and she had a rolling medical bag in one hand and a tote with what looked like a thermal container on top in the other. And she was looking at him with the careful, measured expression of someone who had done their research and was deciding in real time whether the research had been adequate. She did not look afraid. That was notable. Most people who entered this apartment for the first time looked afraid, even the ones trying not to show it. She looked, he searched for the word, alert, like a person who had learned that the best thing to do in uncertain situations was simply to pay close attention. Mr. DeLuca, she said. Her voice was even, quieter than he'd expected, but not timid. There was a distinction. I'm Elena Brooks. Dr. Owens's office arranged. I know who you are, he said. I know why you're here. A pause. Of course. He set down the report he wasn't reading. There are rules. She nodded, set down the tote, and waited. You do not enter rooms I haven't invited you into. You don't ask questions about my work, my business, or my schedule beyond what pertains to my medical treatment. You don't take calls in shared spaces. If people come to this apartment, you make yourself absent. You speak to me when there's a medical reason to speak to me, not because you've decided we should get to know each other. He paused. This is not a social arrangement. Elena looked at him for a moment. Calm. Even. Understood, she said. I'll set up in the guest room Dr. Owens specified. Your afternoon medication is due at 2. I'd like to do a baseline assessment first, blood pressure, heart rate, and a brief review of your current symptoms. It should take about 15 minutes. She picked up the tote. Is there somewhere I can put the soup? He blinked. What soup? I made turkey soup. It travels well, and your diet plan from Dr. Owens's office had a few gaps in the first week that I thought were worth covering. She tilted the thermal container slightly. It's low sodium, no alcohol in the cooking base. He stared at her. She waited, with the patience of someone who is very good at waiting. The kitchen, he said finally. She nodded and moved toward it, unhurried, and Raphael watched her go with the particular off-balance feeling of a man whose rules had just been quietly, completely ignored within the first 4 minutes of their applicability. The first week was a war, and the peculiar thing about it was that only one side knew they were fighting. Raphael maintained his distance with the methodical precision of a man who had been building walls his entire life and knew exactly where every brick went. He kept to his study or the main living area. He received calls and handled business in low tones through an earpiece, so she wouldn't be able to hear the content. When she came to administer medication or take readings, he submitted to it with the controlled tolerance of someone enduring a dental procedure, present, cooperative, fundamentally absent. Elena, for her part, moved through the penthouse with a quality that Raphael found increasingly difficult to categorize. She wasn't loud. She wasn't intrusive. She didn't try to make conversation or fill silences with the kind of nervous chatter that drove him to the edge of his patience. She simply existed in the space. She made small modifications to his environment, blackout curtains in the bedroom that she ordered without asking because she had noticed he wasn't sleeping, a small humidifier in the corner that she positioned based on some calculation about air quality and cardiac recovery, a bowl of fruit on the kitchen counter that was replenished every 2 days without comment. She moved around his rules the way water moved around stone, not confrontationally, not even consciously, as far as he could tell. She just found the routes that his rules hadn't covered, and she went through them. On Tuesday of the second week, he found her in the kitchen at 7 in the morning making something that smelled aggressively good, and he stood in the doorway with his jaw tight and said, I didn't ask for breakfast. No, she agreed, not turning from the stove. You also haven't eaten since yesterday at 4. Your glucose levels will be low, and low glucose in a cardiac recovery patient creates risks that aren't worth taking. She turned and set a plate on the counter. Scrambled eggs with no obvious indulgences. Whole grain toast. A glass of something orange that was not, he realized after a moment, orange juice, but rather some kind of vegetable situation he didn't have the vocabulary for. You don't have to eat it, she said, but it'll be here. She went back to whatever she was doing on the other side of the kitchen. He ate the eggs. He did not comment on this. On Thursday of the second week, one of his captains, a man named Ferraro, older, gray at the temples, the kind of loyal that comes from shared history rather than shared philosophy, arrived without notice at 9 in the evening, which was the kind of thing that happened in Raphael's world without much regard for schedules. Raphael had not made Elena absent in time, and she was in the living room when Ferraro came through. Raphael watched her register Ferraro, the way you might watch someone register a dangerous animal. A quick calibration of the situation, a decision reached without visible distress, and then she set down the medical journal she'd been reading, stood, and said, I'll be in my room, with the same tone she used when she said everything else, which was the tone of a person who had decided to treat all situations with the same quiet levelness, regardless of what the situation actually was. Ferraro watched her go. Then he looked at Raphael. She's not what I expected, he said. She's nobody's business, Raphael said. Sit down. Ferraro sat down. The business they discussed was real and serious and required Raphael's full attention. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a detail snagged on something and didn't let go. The fact that when Elena had stood to leave the room, she had marked her page in the journal first. Not the action of someone shaken, not the action of someone frightened, the action of someone who simply intended to come back to what they were doing. He was not used to people who weren't afraid of him. He wasn't sure what to do with someone who wasn't afraid of him. The bad night came at the end of week 2. It came without warning, the way bad nights usually do. Built from small things. A call that went wrong. A piece of intelligence that suggested someone inside his own organization was passing information to an outside party. A headache that started behind his left eye at noon and worked its way into something larger and more insistent by evening. He'd taken his medication and ignored Dr. Owens's repeated suggestion that he keep a stress journal, which was the single most absurd thing anyone had ever recommended to him, and by 9 o'clock he was sitting in the dark in his study with a glass of water he wasn't drinking and a silence that had weight. He heard her in the hallway. She moved quietly enough that he might not have heard her if the apartment had been less still, but it was still, and he heard the soft sound of her footsteps past the study door, pause, and then nothing. She didn't knock. She didn't open the door. She just stopped. He didn't say anything. After a moment, he heard her move again, and then from the kitchen, the small sounds of something being heated, and 8 minutes later, there was a knock at the study door. "What?" he said. She opened the door and stood in the threshold. She was in pajamas, dark plaid flannel, the kind of thing that suggested she dressed for warmth rather than consideration of being seen, and she was holding a mug in both hands and not making any move to enter the room. "Tea," she said. "Chamomile and valerian. It won't fix whatever's wrong, but it'll help your nervous system stop performing at competition level for a few hours." He stared at her. She didn't come in. She just held the mug in the doorway with the steady patience of someone who was not going to be made to feel foolish for being there. He got up and crossed the room and took the mug. She nodded and left. He drank the tea in the dark and thought about nothing in particular and felt, for the first time in several weeks, his shoulders come down from where they'd been living, which was somewhere around his ears. He did not examine this carefully. The conversation that started to break things open happened on a Friday evening in week 3. He was on the couch. Not something he did habitually. He was more often upright, at his desk or at the window or in motion, but the fatigue that came with cardiac recovery had its own logic, and occasionally it won. And she was doing something at the dining room table, a kind of organized chaos of papers that turned out to be continuing education coursework for her nursing certification. He had asked, without fully planning to ask, what she was working on. She told him. He asked something else. She answered. It was not a conversation exactly at first. It was more like two people talking near each other, and the talking gradually became talking to each other, and neither of them remarked on when the transition happened. She had grown up in North Carolina, a small town east of Raleigh, flat and piney, the kind of place where everybody knew your family going back 3 generations, and sometimes that was comfortable, and sometimes it was a trap. Her mother was still there. Her father had died when she was 17, a sudden thing, an aneurysm, nothing that gave anyone time to prepare. She had gone into nursing partly because of that, the feeling of standing in a hospital hallway being told that the machinery of someone you loved had simply stopped working and nobody being able to adequately explain it, and deciding somewhere in the grief that she wanted to understand the machinery. She talked about this without performing. No particular bid for sympathy, no arrangement of the facts to make them more dramatic than they were. She talked about her father the way someone talked about a thing they had processed and carried for a long time and no longer needed to decorate. Raphael said, "My mother left when I was 9. He did not plan to say that. She looked at him with the same careful attention she gave everything. "Left," she repeated. Not a question. One morning she was there. Next morning she wasn't. My father told me she'd gone back to her family in Milan. He said it like it was a logistical event. He looked at his hands. I believed him for about 2 years. Then I stopped believing him and started understanding that the explanation he'd given me was a version designed to make the fact manageable. Was she... I don't know where she is. He said it flat. I stopped trying to find out. Elena looked at him for a moment. How old were you when you stopped? 16. A silence. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that comes when someone is actually thinking about what you said rather than assembling the next thing they want to say. My father used to say that needing people was a structural weakness, Raphael said. He hadn't intended to say that either. The tea, the stillness, the particular quality of her attention, it was doing something to his usual architecture. He raised me like you'd train an engineer, identified the weak points, and reinforced them. That sounds exhausting, she said. The simplicity of it caught him off guard. Not sympathy, not pity, just observation, like she was noting a fact about a building. It was effective, he said. Those aren't the same thing. He looked at her. She held his gaze with the steadiness of someone who wasn't trying to win anything, just saying a true thing. He looked away first, not because she'd made him uncomfortable exactly, more because she'd said something that landed in a place he hadn't expected it to land, and he needed a moment to figure out what to do with where it had landed. By the end of week 3, Elena had learned the following things about Raphael De Luca. He slept badly and denied it. He read, genuinely read, not performed reading, history and occasionally dense economic theory, and he had opinions about both that he expressed with a precision that told her the reading had been going on for a long time. He drank his coffee black and too hot, and frequently forgot to drink it entirely, which meant there were abandoned cups throughout the apartment at varying stages of coldness. He moved differently when he was genuinely thinking versus when he was performing thought for other people's benefit, and the difference was in his hands. When he was actually in his head, he went very still. When he was performing, he moved with the deliberate certainty of a man who had studied how powerful men were supposed to carry themselves. He was not what she had expected. She had done her research before accepting this placement. She was not naive. She understood who Raphael De Luca was in the general sense that anyone paying attention to certain categories of New York news would understand. The name attached to certain rumors, certain investigations, certain headlines that danced around specifics without landing on them. She had accepted the placement anyway, partly because the pay was substantial, partly because doctor. Owens had vouched for the situation's safety with enough specificity to be credible, and partly because something in the profile had told her this was a man who was genuinely medically vulnerable and who was going to have a very hard time allowing himself to be cared for. She had a particular talent for that situation. What she had not anticipated was the quality of his silence, the way it wasn't hostile, the way it was more like the silence of someone who had been alone for so long that they'd stopped noticing it as a condition. She did not make the mistake of reading too much into it. She was here to do a job. She did the job. And 3 weeks and 4 days into the arrangement, on a Monday morning, Elena was standing in the kitchen doorway with his medication and a glass of water when she heard him talking to someone in the study, not on a call, a real voice. And something in the tone of it made her stop without meaning to. It was Caruso. She had figured out most of the names by now, the faces that cycled through, the hierarchy suggested by who waited and who entered without waiting. Caruso was in the study, and he was saying something in a low, even tone, and Raphael's response came through the partially open door with a flatness that Elena had learned to recognize as the register he used when he was genuinely angry but wasn't going to perform it. "You're telling me it's been 3 weeks," Raphael said. The trail points to someone with access to the Harlem schedules. That narrows it to 6 people. Maybe 5. I know what it narrows it to. A pause. I know exactly what it narrows it to. Another pause. Then, so quiet she almost didn't catch it. Handle it the way it needs to be handled, not the loud way. She moved away from the door before she heard anything else. She set his medication on the counter and went back to her room, and she sat on the edge of the bed for a moment and thought about the man in the other room. The one who made her tea notes and left his coffee to go cold, and admitted in pieces that his father had raised him to believe that needing people was a weakness. She thought about the flatness in his voice just now. She thought about the distance between those two things. She was not going to be foolish about this. She was a professional. She was here for his cardiac recovery. She had a history of her own that had taught her very clearly what happened when you built something on a foundation that had cracks in it, and she was not going to make that mistake again. She was absolutely not going to make that mistake again. She went back to the kitchen when she heard the study door open, and she handed him his medication without making anything of the timing, and he took it without making anything of her expression, and they occupied the same kitchen for 4 minutes without speaking, which was entirely normal by now, and nothing about it felt like nothing. The third week's end brought Raphael's first post-event review appointment with Dr. Owens, and Elena accompanied him because that was standard practice for a private nurse during an early recovery period. The results were, according to Owens, cautiously positive. Blood pressure down from the disaster it had been. Resting heart rate in a range that no longer constituted an active threat. The cardiac damage from the infarction was real and permanent but stable, which was the best outcome available. "You're doing something right," Owens said, and she looked between Raphael and Elena with the precise neutrality of someone who had drawn a conclusion and was not going to voice it. Raphael looked at Elena. Elena looked at the wall chart. In the car on the way back to the tower, they didn't speak for several minutes. Then Raphael said, without looking at her, "The soup helped." Elena turned to look at him. He was watching the city through the window. His face was in its usual arrangement, structured, controlled, the jaw set in the way it was always set. But there was something else, something that had been gradually surfacing over the weeks, like a color coming through paint, a quality she could only describe as present. Like he was actually in the car, actually here, rather than managing the situation from behind glass. "I know," she said. He glanced at her. She looked back at him with the steady, careful attention she gave everything, and for just a moment that lasted about as long as a held breath, something passed between them in the silence that neither of them reached for. Then the car turned onto Fifth Avenue, and the moment closed back up, and they rode the rest of the way in silence. And Elena stared at the city going past the window and told herself very firmly that she was a professional. She was here to do a job. She was going to keep doing the job. But the hand in her lap, she noticed, had closed into a fist sometime in the last few minutes, and she had not noticed until just now, and she made herself open it slowly, deliberately, and lay it flat on her knee. And she thought about nothing. And the car moved through the city, carrying them both somewhere neither of them had quite agreed to go yet. On the last night of week 4, Raphael found her on the terrace. It was late, past 11, the city below doing what it did. Relentless and indifferent and gorgeous, in the way only places indifferent to you can be. She was standing at the railing with a cup of something hot, not his tea, her own, and she was looking out at the lights with the expression of someone who had gone somewhere inside themselves and was taking their time coming back. He stood in the doorway. She heard him. He wasn't quiet, exactly, when he wasn't trying to be, and she turned just enough to acknowledge him without breaking whatever she'd been thinking about. "You should be sleeping," she said. "You should be sleeping," he returned. She accepted this. Turned back to the city. He came and stood at the railing, 2 feet of distance between them, which was closer than they usually stood. The city pressed against the dark. Somewhere below, a siren moved through the grid and faded. The air had the particular edge it got in New York in early November, sharp and clean and indiscriminate. "What were you thinking about?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "A patient I lost," she said. 3 years ago. She was 61, cardiac. Did everything right. Took her medication, adjusted her diet, followed every instruction. She paused. Sometimes the machinery just decides it's done. Doesn't matter what you do. He looked at her profile. The set of her expression, the careful, guarded quality from the photograph, but underneath it something else, something that had been coming to the surface gradually over the weeks like a tide doing what tides do. "Is that why you do it?" he said, knowing that. "Partly," she turned her cup in her hands, "partly because the times when it doesn't end that way are worth the times when it does." He said nothing. She looked at him, and then she said with the quiet directness that was so specifically hers, "You're not going to die from this, Raphael. Not if you keep doing what you're doing." It was the first time she had used his name. He did not examine that. He looked out at the city. "My father would say that's weakness," he said, "caring whether you live." "Your father sounds like a man who decided that the things he was afraid of losing weren't worth caring about," Elena said. "So he stopped caring about them and called it strength." The silence that came after that was different from the other silences. It had a different weight to it, a different quality of the air. Raphael stood at the railing and felt something move in his chest, that had nothing to do with cardiac muscle damage, something older and less clinical, something that had been locked in a room for 32 years and was pressing on the door with both hands. He did not open the door, but he stood there on the terrace beside this woman in the cold November air and felt it pressing, and he did not move away from it, and that, for Rafael De Luca, was the most dangerous thing that had happened to him since the night on the carpet. Far more dangerous than the heart attack. The heart attack, at least he knew how to survive. He wasn't sure he knew how to survive this. He found out the next morning that the man passing information from inside his organization was someone he had trusted for 11 years. Not Marco, not Caruso, not Ferraro. Someone closer. And in the moment Caruso delivered the name, standing in the study, keeping his voice flat and professional the way Rafael had taught him to, because you didn't let feeling run the room. Rafael felt the old architecture come back up fast and hard and complete. Every wall and every brick, the structure his father had built and he had maintained and reinforced for 32 years, the one that kept everything out, the one that kept him standing. He looked at Caruso. He said, "Get out." Caruso got out. Rafael stood alone in the study and stared at the name written on the piece of paper in his hand, and understood with absolute clarity that this was going to require a response that would reach into every part of his world, and that the response would be quiet and it would be permanent. And this was what he was. This was what he had always been. And whatever had been moving in his chest on the terrace last night was going to have to find somewhere else to go. He folded the paper. He picked up his phone. And somewhere in the apartment, he could hear Elena in the kitchen, moving carefully, unhurried, making something that would smell good in 20 minutes, filling the space of his life with a warmth he had not asked for and could not seem to refuse. And the distance between that sound and the paper in his hand was the longest distance he had ever stood across. He made the call, and the world he had built closed back around him, dark and complete and familiar. And from the kitchen, the small sounds continued. And Rafael De Luca stood between two worlds with the phone pressed to his ear, and for the first time in 32 years, he wasn't sure which one he was choosing. The name on the paper was Sal Benedetto. Sal Benedetto, who had been with Rafael since Rafael was 21 years old and still learning which rooms to walk into and which ones to leave to his father. Sal Benedetto, who had stood at Rafael's left shoulder at 3 separate funerals and 2 federal depositions and a warehouse negotiation in Red Hook that could have gone catastrophically wrong and didn't, partly because Sal had read the room in time and said the right 4 words to the right man. Sal Benedetto, who was 53 years old and had a daughter at Fordham, and a wife who made Sunday gravy from a recipe that had crossed 2 oceans, and who had eaten at Rafael's table 17 times in the last year alone. Sal Benedetto was selling schedules to the Marchetti family out of Philadelphia. Rafael stood in the study for 4 minutes after Caruso left, not moving, the paper folded in his hand. His breathing was even. That was the thing about the old architecture when it came back up. It made everything even. The breathing, the expression, the hands. It flattened the landscape. He made the call. 2 sentences. A name and an instruction. Then he put the phone in his jacket pocket and went into the kitchen. Elena was at the counter, her back to him, doing something with vegetables that involved a great deal of precise, unhurried cutting. She had the radio on, something low, a jazz station she'd found in the second week and apparently decided was acceptable background. And she didn't turn around when he came in, which meant she hadn't heard him, which meant she was comfortable enough in the space to stop monitoring the door. He hadn't realized until just now that he'd been noticing things like that. "Breakfast is in 10 minutes, she said without turning. "Your blood pressure reading first." "I need to go out," he said. She turned. She looked at him with the careful attention she gave everything, except this time there was something additional in it. A small, precise adjustment, like a doctor noting a change in a patient's color. She was reading him. He was aware of being read, and found it neither comfortable nor intolerable, which was itself unusual. "Your morning medication hasn't been administered yet," she said. "I'll take it when I'm back." Raphael. His name in her mouth again, calm and direct. Dr. Owen's protocol is specific about the medication timing. The window is 30 minutes on either side of 7 a.m. If you miss it, then give it to me now. She looked at him for one more second, that assessment, that quiet calibration. and then she went to the medical bag on the counter and prepared the medication without another word. She handed him the pills and the water and watched him take them with the professional attention of someone who did not yet fully trust that he wouldn't pocket them when she looked away, which was fair because in the first week he had done exactly that twice. He swallowed, showed her his empty hand. She nodded. "I'll be back by noon," he said. "Your appointment with Dr. Owens is at 2. "I know." He was already moving toward the elevator. He heard her behind him, not following, just standing at the kitchen threshold, and he knew without looking that she was watching him with that expression, the one that didn't quite land on worry, but wasn't entirely neutral either, and he got into the elevator and pressed the lobby button and kept his eyes forward. The doors closed. In the elevator's mirror, he looked at his own face, even, controlled, the jaw set in the way his father had taught him to set it. Sal Benedetto. 11 years. The elevator descended. The meeting happened in a parking structure in Midtown, 3rd level, the kind of place chosen specifically because it was too ordinary to surveil efficiently. Marco was already there when Raphael arrived, standing beside a black sedan with the patient stillness of a man who had been briefed and was waiting for instruction. Caruso flanked him. 2 others Raphael trusted, not because they'd earned it philosophically, but because their interests were precisely aligned with his, which was the only kind of trust he had ever allowed himself. Sal was sitting in the sedan's back seat. Raphael opened the door and got in beside him. Sal was 60. Raphael had miscalculated. 53 was wrong. He was 60, had been 60 for 2 months. And he looked it in a way he hadn't 6 months ago. Gray in the temples had spread. The hands on his thighs were a man's hands who hadn't been sleeping, and the eyes, when they came up to meet Raphael's, had the particular quality of someone who had been carrying weight for a long time and was almost relieved to put it down. Almost. "How long?" Raphael said. Sal's jaw worked. "How long, Sal?" 7 months. 7 months. That was 3 months before the cardiac event. That meant Sal had been at the table, in the meetings, standing in rooms where schedules and routes and names were discussed, for 7 months, and had been feeding all of it. "Why?" Raphael said. "My daughter." Sal stopped. Tried again. "Fordham tuition? Her apartment? I got behind. I got very behind. And they came to me when I was already behind, and they didn't threaten her. They didn't have to threaten her. They just made clear that they knew about her, where she lived, which subway she took." The car was very quiet. "You could have come to me," Raphael said. Sal looked at him. Something moved through his expression, grief or shame, or a specific combination of the two that had no clean name. "When?" he said. "You were building the Harlem corridor, then the waterfront restructure, then the DeLuca Tower expansion, and you were becoming what you are now, Raphael. There was no version of that conversation that didn't end with me being a liability. So instead you made yourself a different kind of liability." Sal didn't answer. "The Marchetti family knows the waterfront schedule," Raphael said. "They know the Harlem routes. They know the names of 3 of my captains." He paused. "What else?" Sal was quiet for 4 seconds. Each second had its own particular weight. "They have a partial list of the shell companies, through the waterfront operation." Raphael said nothing. The partial list of shell companies through the waterfront operation was, if assembled correctly with other information the Marchetti family might have gathered from other sources, within range of something that could reach his father, could reach the original architecture of the DeLuca operation going back 20 years, could reach things that Raphael had spent enormous effort ensuring were untouchable. He sat with this for a moment. Sal sat beside him and breathed. "I'm going to ask you one more thing," Raphael said, "and I need the true answer." Sal nodded. "Is there anyone else?" Sal closed his eyes. "No." Raphael looked at him for a long moment with the even, flat expression of a man running calculations that had nothing to do with mathematics. "Get out of the city," he said. "Tonight. Take your wife. Your daughter stays at Fordham. I'll have someone watching her, not because she's a threat, because she isn't part of this. But you're done here. You're done in any city I operate in. You understand that." Sal opened his eyes. He looked at Raphael with an expression that had, at its bottom, something that might have been gratitude, which was the most painful kind of expression possible under the circumstances. "I understand," he said. "Get out of the car." Sal got out of the car. Raphael sat in the empty back seat and stared at the concrete column directly ahead, and breathed in and out with the measured, deliberate rhythm he had learned to use when the pressure in his chest started to build. And he thought about 11 years, and he thought about Sunday gravy, and he thought about what his father would have done, and he thought about the 4 seconds of silence before Sal answered the last question. Then he got out of the car and told Marco to handle the security rotation and went back to the tower. But he was back by 11:15. Elena was in the living room with her continuing education coursework spread across the coffee table, and she looked up when he came through, did her quick calibration, and said nothing. He went past her to the kitchen, poured water, drank half of it standing at the counter. She appeared in the doorway. "Blood pressure," she said. "Elena, you went out under stress and came back under more stress." "Blood pressure." She held up the cuff. He turned from the counter, set down the glass, and sat at the kitchen table. She came and wrapped the cuff around his arm with the efficient, practiced movements of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and he looked at the table surface while she worked and felt the pressure of the cuff and heard the small digital beeps. She looked at the reading, and her expression did a careful thing. Absorbed the information, processed it, chose not to dramatize it. "It's elevated," she said. "I know. Do you want to tell me what happened?" "No." She removed the cuff, folded it, set it on the table between them, and then sat, not across from him but at the corner, the way she sometimes did when the conversation was going to be real rather than clinical. "You're not going to hurt yourself doing whatever it is you do," she said. "Are you?" He looked at her. "I mean physically," she said, and her voice was absolutely level. "I'm not asking about anything else. I'm asking whether I'm going to need to provide emergency care today." "No," he said. She nodded, accepted this. "Then I'm going to make lunch, and you're going to sit here and let your blood pressure come down. And at 2, we're going to Dr. Owens's office." She stood. "That's the plan." He watched her move to the refrigerator. He said, "You never ask me to be something different." She stopped, turned. "Other people," he said, and he wasn't sure why he was saying it, only that the morning had cracked something open and it was speaking before he could close it back up. "They're always managing me toward something, toward who they need me to be for them to feel safe. You don't do that." She looked at him for a moment. "You're already something," she said. "I'm just here to make sure you don't die from it." It wasn't soft. It wasn't sentimental. It landed exactly where it was true, and it landed there without decoration. And he looked at this woman in his kitchen in the November light and felt the thing behind the wall press harder than it had pressed yet. He looked away. "Lunch," he said. "Working on it," she said. The Dr. Owens appointment went cleanly. Numbers moving in the right direction. The elevated morning reading was noted and contextualized. Owens looked at Raphael with her particular diagnostic neutrality and said that the recovery trajectory was better than she'd projected. And then she looked at Elena and said, "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." And Elena said, "Soup and sleep." And Owens almost smiled. In the car back, Raphael said, "You told her soup and sleep." "Those are the primary interventions," Elena said. "There are other things." She looked at him. "You fixed my curtains," he said. "You ordered that humidifier without asking. You make sure I take my medication on time, and you haven't once made me feel like a patient being managed." He paused. "That's not soup and sleep." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "it's not." The car moved through midtown traffic. The light was going flat and gray the way November light did in the afternoons. "I had a patient once," she said, "who spent the first 6 weeks of his recovery treating everyone around him like they were either useful or in the way. His wife, his kids, his doctors. Like the cardiac event was a problem to be solved rather than his body telling him something about how he'd been living." She paused. "He had a second event 14 months later." Raphael didn't say anything. "I think about that a lot," she said, "about what the body is trying to say when it does what yours did, and whether the person is willing to hear it." "What was it saying?" Raphael said. "Mine." She looked at him. "That you've been running on something that isn't sustainable," she said, "and that the structure you've built, the one that keeps everything and everyone at distance, is part of what's costing you. The car stopped at a light. He looked at her. She held his gaze with that steady, honest attention, and there was nothing in it that demanded anything from him, no agenda underneath it, just a person saying a true thing and leaving it with him to do with what he would. The light changed. The car moved. Raphael looked out the window and said nothing, and the thing behind the wall was very loud now, and he thought about Sal, and 11 years, and the partial list of shell companies, and the distance between the life he had built and the kitchen in the morning light, and he couldn't make those things cohere into something manageable. So he stopped trying and just sat with both of them at once. Vincenzo De Luca called that evening at 7. Raphael took the call in the study with the door closed, which was standard, but this time Elena could hear from the kitchen where she was making his dinner that the call was different from the usual ones. Not from words, she couldn't make out words, but from the rhythm of it. The pauses were shorter. Raphael's responses were shorter. The silence at the end, before he ended the call, was the kind that happened after something had been said that required a decision. He came out of the study 14 minutes later. His face was the face it always was, even, controlled, the jaw set. But she had been in this apartment for a month, and she had learned the small things, the way his shoulders sat when the control was real versus when it was performance. Right now his shoulders were doing the performance. "Are you hungry?" she said. "No." "You need to eat." "Elena." "I know," she said, "but you still need to eat." He stopped in the middle of the living room with both hands in his pockets and looked at the floor for a moment, and in the 2 seconds of that she saw something happen in his expression. Not collapse, nothing that dramatic, just a brief opening, a small moment when the wall became briefly permeable. Then he looked up. "Set the table," he said, "please." The please landed like something being said for the first time in a foreign language. Like the word itself was being tested to see if it still worked. She set the table. They ate. He told her partway through that his father wanted him to handle a business situation that would require travel. 2 days, possibly 3, to Philadelphia. That it was urgent and that the timing was complicated. He didn't say anything else about it. She didn't ask. But after dinner, when she was washing up and he was standing in the kitchen doorway watching the way he sometimes did now, she said, without turning, "You don't have to go." He was quiet. "I know that it might feel like you do," she said, "like the whole structure requires it. But the cardiac protocol? The cardiac protocol isn't why you're saying that." She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the controlled one, not the performed one. Something underneath both of those, something that had been working its way to the surface for a month. She held his gaze. "No," she said. "It's not." The kitchen was very quiet. He crossed it. He stopped when he was close enough that she could have counted the details of his face, the line across his forehead that shouldn't be on a 32-year-old, the slight asymmetry at his jaw from a break that hadn't been set correctly, the dark of his eyes in the kitchen light. "I've been trying," he said, low, "to keep this very clear." "I know," she said. "I've been trying to keep the lines where they are." "I know. It's becoming difficult," he said. His voice was flat, factual, like he was reporting a condition rather than confessing to one. She looked at him for a long moment. "I know that too," she said. He reached up and his hand was at her jaw, not pulling her anywhere, just there, his thumb at the edge of her cheekbone, and the contact was so unfamiliar for both of them that neither moved for a second, just stood with it. She put her hand over his. He looked at her like she was something he didn't have a category for. She said very quietly, "Philadelphia can wait." And his phone went off. Not a ringtone. The specific buzz pattern that she had learned meant something urgent from one of his captains. It went off once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. His hand dropped. He stepped back. He looked at her for one more second with that expression, the unguarded one, the one that had no wall in it. And then he took the phone from his pocket and looked at the screen, and something happened in his face. Something fast and terrible. A door closing. "I have to take this," he said. "Raphael?" He was already moving toward the study. The door closed. She stood in the kitchen with her hand still slightly raised from where it had covered his, and she heard his voice through the door, low, urgent, the cadence of crisis. And she lowered her hand slowly and turned back to the sink. She turned the water on. She stood there with the water running over her hands. Whatever had just happened in the few feet of kitchen was still there, still present, like a charge in the air after lightning. The storm itself gone, but everything still vibrating from where it had passed through. She was not going to examine it right now. She was not going to make decisions about what it meant or what came next. She was going to wash the dishes and be still and wait. But her hands, she noticed, were not quite steady. And somewhere behind the study door, Rafael DeLuca was learning something that was going to change everything. She could hear it in the register of his voice, low and flat, and stripped of everything except attention. And she had the specific, unwanted certainty of someone who had been in enough rooms with enough crisis to recognize its particular quality. Something was coming. She didn't know its shape yet, but it was already in the building, moving up through the floors, and by morning it was going to be. The call lasted 19 minutes. Elena knew because she watched the clock on the microwave without meaning to, the way you watch something when your hands are busy and your mind is somewhere else entirely. She finished the dishes, dried them, put them away in the places she had learned they belonged over the past month, the exact shelves, the exact order, the small geography of a life she had been living inside without quite meaning to make herself at home in. The study door opened at 8:47. Raphael came out and he was already different. She could see it in the first second, the way he was wearing himself. The particular set of the body that meant the wall wasn't just up, but reinforced, mortared, no gaps anywhere. He had the phone in his hand, and he wasn't looking at the kitchen, wasn't looking at her, was moving toward the hallway with the focused forward momentum of a man who had somewhere to be and had already decided everything else was secondary. "I need to leave tonight," he said. Not to her exactly, just into the air of the apartment. "Raphael, your medication at 10. I'll take it with me." He stopped at the hallway entrance and turned and looked at her for exactly 1 second. The expression was closed, not hostile, not cold, just absent, like someone had turned a light off behind his eyes. "I'll be back in 2 days, 3 at most. You stay here." "I stay here," she repeated. "The apartment is secure. Marco will have someone on the lobby. You don't need to worry about anything." "I'm not worried about myself," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. The kitchen still had the charge in it, the residue of what had almost happened 40 minutes ago, and they were both standing in it. And he knew it, and she knew it, and he was choosing, right now, in real time, to walk away from it. "Take the full medication kit," she said finally. "The blue bag, not just the pill case. If your blood pressure spikes and you're in a car somewhere, I know. The nitro's in the front pocket. Don't forget, Elena." His voice stopped her, low and even. "I know." She pressed her lips together, nodded. He went down the hallway. She heard him in the bedroom, the sounds of someone packing with the efficiency of a man who had done it 100 times, no wasted motion, no hesitation. She stood at the kitchen threshold and looked at the table where they'd eaten 40 minutes ago, the 2 plates still faintly warm, and she thought about his hand at her jaw and the weight of his thumb at the edge of her cheekbone, and she made herself stop thinking about it. He came back through with a bag over his shoulder. At the elevator, he stopped. He turned around. She was still standing at the kitchen threshold, and she hadn't moved. And he looked at her from across the apartment with the closed expression, and then something in it shifted. Very slightly, very briefly, like a seam in the wall catching light. "I'll call," he said. She didn't say anything. The elevator opened. He got in. The doors closed. The apartment was so quiet after that it seemed to push against her. He called once, on the second day, at 6 in the morning. His voice was clipped and factual. Blood pressure was fine. Medication was on schedule. He'd be back by tomorrow evening. She said that was good. He said yes. There was a pause that lasted 4 seconds and contained everything neither of them said. And then he ended the call. She sat on the edge of her bed with the phone in her lap and the gray November morning pressing against the window, and she thought about the 4-second pause with a discipline that eventually became exhausting, and she put the phone face down on the nightstand and went to make coffee. On the third morning, someone else arrived. She was in the living room at 9:15 when the elevator opened. She didn't know the elevator could open without her keying anything, filed that detail away. And Vincenzo DeLuca walked into the apartment like he owned it, which technically and historically he probably felt he did. She had seen him once before, briefly, the second week, when he'd come and Raphael had made her absent. She'd only caught a glimpse. Now she had the full version, and the full version was a man who had arranged himself so thoroughly into an idea of power that the human being underneath was almost entirely obscured. The charcoal suit, the unhurried movement, the eyes, darker than Raphael's, and with something in them that Raphael's didn't have, a quality of permanent calculation. Like everything encountered was being assessed for utility, he looked at her with those eyes. "Miss Brooks," he said. "Mr. DeLuca." She stood. "Raphael isn't here." "I know. I've come to speak with you." He moved to the sitting area and lowered himself into the armchair, Raphael's armchair, the one he used. With the ease of someone who had never in his life asked permission to sit anywhere, he gestured toward the couch. "Please." She sat, because she was not going to stand in her own borrowed space being managed by a man who had decided the gesture was a favor. He looked at her for a moment. The assessment, the utility calculation. "You care about my son," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm his nurse," she said. "You're more than that, and we both know it. Raphael is not a man who allows proximity." He crossed his legs. "What you've accomplished in a month, getting past that particular wall, requires either great skill or genuine feeling. I suspect in your case it's both." Elena said nothing. She had learned from years of working beside difficult men in difficult rooms that silence was information too, and that giving it away when someone was trying to draw you out was a mistake. "I want you to understand something," Vincenzo said, and his voice was even, almost kind, the voice of a man delivering information for someone else's benefit. "Raphael has been building this empire since he was 19 years old. I helped him. I taught him what I knew, which was considerable. The architecture of what he's built, the operations, the alliances, the structures that keep everything functional, it requires a very specific kind of man to maintain." "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because you are changing him." He said it simply. No accusation. A fact being presented. "I've watched my son for 32 years. I know every version of him, what you've done, the warmth you've brought into this apartment, the way you've treated him like a human being rather than a crime lord. It's gotten inside his walls in a way that nothing else ever has." He paused. "And that is, for him, the most dangerous thing possible." Elena looked at him steadily. Dangerous to whom? Something moved through his expression, not quite a smile, an acknowledgement. "To everyone," he said, "to the organization that depends on his particular nature, to the men who need him to be what he is, and ultimately, to you." He let that sit. "You're a quiet woman from a small town in North Carolina. You lost a child. You lost a marriage. You rebuilt yourself carefully, and you are not the kind of person who survives in the world Raphael DeLuca inhabits." The air in the room went very still. She hadn't told Raphael about the child. She had told him about the divorce, about the infidelity, but not the specific loss. The daughter who had been 5 months along when everything broke apart, the name she had chosen and never used, the particular grief of losing two things at once that were entangled in each other. She looked at Vincenzo DeLuca and understood that he had a file on her, that he had known everything about her before Raphael approved the hire, that this conversation was not a surprise visit. This conversation had been prepared. "You've done your research," she said. Her voice was even. She was proud of how even it was. "I do research on everyone in my son's orbit." He uncrossed his legs, leaned forward slightly. "I'm not here to threaten you, Ms. Brooks. I want that understood. I'm here because I've watched Raphael begin to imagine a version of his life that he cannot have, and I believe, genuinely believe, that allowing him to continue imagining it will destroy him more thoroughly than any federal investigation or rival family ever could." He paused. "Because when it ends, and it will end, these things always end. He will not recover. You'll leave or be taken or simply realize that you cannot live inside what his life actually is. And what he will become after that loss is something I don't want to see." The room was very quiet. She could hear distantly the city below. Traffic. The ordinary sounds of a world that had no idea this conversation was happening 43 floors above it. "I'm asking you," Vincenzo said, "to end this quietly, before it goes further. Return to your profession, to a life that fits you." He stood. You're not cruel. I don't believe you want to hurt him, so don't. He buttoned his jacket. Leave before he has something real to lose. He walked to the elevator. At the elevator, he paused, and he did what his son had done on the night he left. He stopped and turned and looked at her across the apartment. But where Raphael's gaze had carried that brief opening, that seam of light, Vincenzo's gaze carried only certainty. The certainty of a man who had decided long ago that the world worked a specific way and had spent 30 years proving himself right. He will choose the empire, Vincenzo said. He always does. That is what I built him to do. He paused. The question is only whether you're still here when he makes that choice, and whether you can survive watching him make it. The elevator opened. He left. She sat on the couch for a long time. She sat the way you sit when something has rearranged the furniture of your interior life, and you're not ready to move yet because you're not sure where anything is anymore. The November light came through the high windows and moved across the floor, and she watched it and did not think about anything in particular because thinking about anything in particular would require choosing where to start, and she didn't know where to start. She thought about her daughter, not the way she usually thought about her. From a distance, with the careful management of someone who had learned to carry a weight without showing it. She thought about her the way you think about something when someone strips the management away and the feeling is just there, immediate and raw. 5 months. She had made it to 5 months, and she had had a name. Clara, she'd decided on Clara in the 2nd month. And then the infidelity had surfaced, and the marriage had collapsed, and in the middle of all of that, during a week when her husband had moved out, and she was sleeping on her mother's couch in Raleigh and eating nothing and sleeping 16 hours a day, her body had done what bodies do when everything else is falling apart. She had never told anyone the name. She had rebuilt. That was the word people used, rebuilt, as though a person were a structure that could be demolished and reconstructed according to the same blueprint. She had come to New York. She had done the work. She had gotten very good at taking up exactly the amount of space that was needed and not 1 inch more. She was not going to fall apart in Rafael De Luca's living room. She got up. She went to her room and she sat on the bed and she opened her phone and she looked at it for a while, at nothing specific, just the bright rectangle of it in her hand. She thought about what Vincenzo had said, and she thought about what he hadn't said, and she tried to calculate the distance between the two. He was right about one thing. She was not equipped for this world. She had known that from the first day, walking out of the elevator with her medical bag and her turkey soup, looking at this man in his armchair who had built a life designed specifically to keep people exactly as far away as she had somehow, over a month, managed not to stay. He was possibly right about a second thing. When it ended, and she had always known, underneath everything, that it would end, that this was not a story with a clean outcome. The ending would be bad. For her. For him. For whatever this thing was that had been building in the space between medical readings and late-night terraces and kitchen moments that lasted 4 seconds too long. She thought about his voice on the phone this morning, the 4-second pause. She thought about his hand at her jaw. She thought about his face when he'd told her about his mother. The flat, factual way he'd said it, like he'd rehearsed the delivery over 30 years until it didn't cost him anything, except she could tell it still cost him everything. She was not going to make this decision from this couch in this room, with Vincenzo De Luca's words still in the air. She picked up the phone and she almost called Raphael. She held the phone for 30 seconds. She put it down. She needed to think, and she could not think clearly from inside this apartment, so she put on her coat and she went downstairs, nodding at the man in the lobby who nodded back with the particular alertness of someone being paid to watch her. And she walked out into the November cold and let the city work on her the way cities did when you needed to be anonymous for an hour. She walked north. No destination. Just walking. The kind of walking that was really thinking with your body instead of your head. The cold came through her coat in a good way, clarifying, honest. She thought about Vincenzo's final line. He will choose the empire. That is what I built him to do. And she thought about something else. Something she had been carrying since the kitchen 2 nights ago, since his thumb at her cheekbone, since the 4-second pause on the phone. She had been so focused on her own feelings, on managing herself, on not being foolish, that she had not fully looked at what she was watching happen to him. She had watched it happen. She had watched him become, over 4 weeks, something different from what he'd been when she arrived. Something that was still Rafael De Luca, still the controlled and formidable and fundamentally solitary man who had looked at her with wariness from across his conference room, but with something coming back online that had been off for a very long time. She had watched him learn to sit still. She had watched him remember how to ask for something. She had watched him stand on a terrace in the cold and talk about his mother with the voice of a man who had stopped needing to perform. She walked 3 blocks thinking about that. Then her phone went off. She almost didn't look at it. Then she looked. It was not Raphael. It was a number she didn't recognize, and the message was 4 words. Check your email, now. She stopped on the sidewalk with pedestrians moving around her. She opened her email, scrolled past the routine items, found one from an address she didn't recognize, sent 18 minutes ago, and opened it. It was a photograph. Raphael, in what looked like a parking structure, talking to a man she didn't know. Behind them, visible through the open car door, another man whose face was turned away. But his profile, the angle of his jaw, the line of his shoulder, was familiar enough that her stomach pulled tight before she understood why. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she looked at the text below it, which read, "His father set up the Marchetti meeting. The Benedetto leak was a test. He wanted to know if Raphael would choose mercy or strategy. He failed their test. They're not done." She stood on the sidewalk and the city moved around her, and she thought about Vincenzo in the armchair telling her with great gentleness to leave. She thought about the timing, his visit today, Raphael gone, the carefully constructed kindness of the conversation, the precision of it. She thought about what it meant that someone had sent her this photograph. She thought about what it meant that the photograph existed. Her hands were cold. She hadn't noticed until now. She closed the email and looked at the street and took 3 careful breaths and thought, someone is using me. Either Vincenzo used this visit to push me out before I could become leverage, or someone else is using this message to pull me further in. She did not know which. She did not know who had sent it. But she knew one thing with the flat, undecorated clarity that comes when you strip everything else away. Raphael was coming home tomorrow. And when he came home, something was going to have to be said. Not about the photograph, not yet. She didn't know enough to say anything about the photograph, but about the kitchen. About his hand and her hand and the 4-second pause, about the thing that had been building in the space of this apartment for a month and had run out of room to keep building without becoming a decision. She was not equipped for his world. She had never been equipped for his world, but she was standing on a sidewalk in November with a photograph on her phone and the words of a man who had built his son into a weapon telling her to leave, and the truth she kept arriving at, no matter which direction she approached it from, was that she did not want to leave. That was the truth she kept arriving at. And she stood on that sidewalk with the cold working through her coat, and the city indifferent around her, and she let herself say it plainly, at least inside her own head, at least once. She did not want to leave. She did not want to go back to Raleigh or take another placement or rebuild herself a 3rd time into someone smaller and more careful and better at staying at the right distance from the things that mattered. She was tired of being at the right distance. She walked back to the tower. She went upstairs and she made dinner and she ate it alone and she put the photograph in a folder on her phone and she did not look at it again that night. She took her time thinking. She made herself be methodical about it, the way she was methodical about everything, laying the facts out, examining them, deciding what was known and what was assumption and what was the kind of feeling that dressed itself up as logic. When it wanted to get somewhere, logic wouldn't take it. By midnight, she had made no decisions. By 6 the next morning, she had made one. She was going to tell him about the photograph. She was going to tell him about his father's visit. And then she was going to let him do what he did with that information. And whatever he chose, whatever version of himself he chose, she was going to be honest about what that meant for her. Not as a demand, not as an ultimatum. Just as a true thing said plainly by a person who was done arranging herself to fit what other people needed from her. She was in the kitchen when the elevator opened at 7:43. He came through the door and he looked like 2 days of something she didn't want to name. The particular exhaustion of a man who has been running on adrenaline and controlled anger for 48 hours and is starting to feel the edges of it. His jacket was gone. The collar of his shirt was open. There was a bruise at his left jaw, fresh, the kind of dark blue that meant less than 24 hours, and his eyes had the hollow quality of someone who had not slept. He stopped when he saw her. She looked at the bruise. "Sit down," she said. "Elena, Raphael, sit down." He sat at the kitchen table. She got the first aid kit from the medical bag. She had moved it to the kitchen counter in the second week because that was where it turned out to be needed. And she came to the table and began working on the bruise, cleaning the skin around it, checking the jaw for structural damage with light pressure, and he let her do it with the stillness of someone who was too tired to resist. "What happened?" she said. "Occupational." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have." He looked at her face while she worked, close range, the way he had on the terrace, with that expression that had nothing performed in it. "You look like you haven't slept either." "I haven't." "Why?" She set down the cotton and looked at him. "Your father came while you were gone," she said. Something moved through him, fast and then locked down. "When?" "Yesterday morning." She sat across from him. "He sat in your armchair, and he told me very carefully and very kindly that I was changing you in ways that were dangerous, and that I should leave before it went further." She kept her voice level. "He knew about my daughter, Raphael, the pregnancy, the loss, things I haven't told you." The kitchen was very quiet. Raphael looked at her with an expression that was doing several things at once, all of them locked down, all of them pressing on the locks from the inside. "He had you investigated," he said. "Thoroughly. Before I was hired, I'd guess." She paused. "I don't think that's the important part." "What's the important part?" She picked up her phone, found the email, turned it toward him. He looked at the photograph for a long time. His jaw tightened. The bruise darkened with the tension in it, and she watched him process what he was seeing. The parking structure, the figures, the profile of the third man, and she watched the moment he understood what he was looking at. "Who sent this?" he said. "I don't know." He read the text below the photograph, read it twice, set the phone down on the table with a precision that was the controlled version of something else entirely. "The Benedetto leak was a test," he said. "Not to her." Just thinking out loud, which was something he had started doing, she realized, sometime in the third week, without apparently noticing. "My father ran it. Sal came to them. Or they went to Sal and he was already compromised enough to say yes, and they used it to see whether I'd—" He stopped. "Whether you'd what?" she said. He looked at her. "Whether I'd gone soft," he said. The words landed flat and ugly. She looked back at him. "Had you?" she said. The question sat between them like something that had been dropped from a height. His jaw worked. The bruise pulled. "I let Sal walk," he said. "My father would have made an example. I let him walk." He looked at the table. "I told myself it was strategy. Mercy without witnesses is still information control." He paused. "My father has been watching me for a month, and he saw something different." "He saw you becoming something different," Elena said. "Same thing." "No," she said. "It isn't." He looked at her with the exhausted, stripped expression of a man who is running out of surfaces to present. "You need to eat," she said, "and then we need to talk about what's in that photograph. Because whoever sent it to me did it for a reason, and the reason matters." He looked at her for a long time. "You're not leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. It was something more uncertain than a question. A man checking something he was afraid to find missing. "Not yet," she said. "Eat first." He ate. She sat across from him and drank coffee and watched him eat and didn't fill the silence with anything. And when he finished, he pushed the plate aside and put both elbows on the table and pressed his hands against his face for a moment. Just a moment. A brief surrender to the weight of it. And then dropped them. "My father set the Marchetti meeting," he said. "That's what the message says." "Yes, which means the Philadelphia situation, what pulled me out of here 2 nights ago, was manufactured. Or at minimum, managed." He looked at the table. "He needed me out of the apartment." "So he could talk to me without you here," Elena said. "So he could talk to you without me here." He stood, moved to the window, the Manhattan skyline pressing its indifferent weight against the glass. "He's been watching this for a month, watching me." His voice had a new quality in it. Not anger yet. Something underneath anger. Something older. and he decided that the way to deal with it wasn't to talk to me. It was to come after you. He wasn't cruel about it, she said. Raphael turned. He was very measured, she said. He made legitimate points. About your world, about who I am, about what happens when... She stopped. He made points that weren't entirely wrong. Elena. I'm not defending him. I'm saying he was precise about it. He knew exactly which things to say. She met his eyes. He knew about Clara. The name landed in the room. Raphael went very still. The pregnancy, she said. The loss. I hadn't told you. I told you about the divorce, about the infidelity, but not that specific. Not her. And he said it in passing, just as part of his case, just as a data point that proved he'd done thorough research. And Her voice did something small, and she controlled it. I understood in that moment exactly how much he knows about both of us, about what's been happening in this apartment. Raphael came away from the window. He crossed the kitchen and sat back down across from her, and he looked at her with the focused, stripped attention of a man who had decided something but hadn't said it yet. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him. He had no right to use that, he said, low, flat, furious in the way that lived underneath level voices. That was yours. He had no right. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. He didn't. A silence. Then Raphael's phone rang. Not the same buzz pattern as before. A ringtone, Marco's specific one. And Raphael picked up on the second ring and said, "What?" And the answer came through fast enough that she could hear the pace of it, if not the words. She watched Raphael's face. She watched it absorb the information. She watched the shift happen, the one she'd been seeing happen in degrees over the past month, except this time it went the wrong direction. She watched the wall come up, brick by brick, fast and total. And by the time the call ended and he lowered the phone, the man sitting across from her looked like the man who had been in the armchair on the first day, controlled, present, and somewhere behind the glass. The Marchetti family made a move on the waterfront this morning, he said. Not a negotiation, a physical move. 2 of my men are in a hospital in Brooklyn. She absorbed this. How bad? She said. One of them is serious. His voice was absolutely flat. They used the schedule information, Sal's information. They knew exactly when the shift changed and who would be where. The kitchen was very quiet. This is my father's place, he said, and he wasn't talking to her now. He was thinking out loud, but the thinking had edges on it. He pushed me out of the apartment. He came after you to destabilize this, whatever this is. And meanwhile, he's been running a negotiation with the Marchetti family using my operation's vulnerabilities as currency. He looked at the table. He's trying to force a merger, or a submission. He wants the DeLuca operation folded into a larger structure, and he knows I won't agree to it. So he's been engineering the conditions under which I have no choice. Raphael, she said. He looked at her. Your blood pressure, she said. I don't care about my blood pressure right now. I do, she said. Quiet, firm. You're 32 years old, and you had a cardiac event 6 weeks ago, and you are sitting in this kitchen getting ready to do something that is going to require everything you have physically, and you need to know your numbers before you walk out of here. He stared at her. She held his gaze. He pushed his left arm across the table. She got the cuff, wrapped it, took the reading. The number was bad. Not catastrophic, but bad. The kind of number that lived 2 standard deviations from where it should be and had no business being there in a man with his history. She looked at the number and then looked at him. If you leave this apartment in the state you're in right now, she said, without medication adjustment, without rest, running on... She stopped. I can't stop you. I know that, but I need you to understand what I'm telling you. I understand, he said. Do you? Elena. He looked at her with the closed expression, and then it cracked, just slightly, just at the edge. And she saw briefly the man who had stood on the terrace and talked about his mother with his voice stripped down to the bone. I understand. I hear you. But 2 of my men are in a hospital, and my father has been running a play against my operation for months, and I do not have the option of sitting still. Then let me come with you, she said. The words surprised both of them. He stared. You have 2 men in a hospital, she said. Whatever else happens today, you'll end up somewhere that has casualties. Take me. She met his gaze. You know I can handle it. Something moved through his expression, the assessment, the calculation, and underneath it something else. Something that was neither of those things, something that had her name on it. No, he said. Raphael. No. He stood. Not because I think you can't handle it. Because if something happens to you... He stopped. The unfinished sentence sat between them. She looked at him. He looked back. Stay here, he said. Lock the elevator. Marco will have 2 men downstairs. Do not open this apartment to anyone, not even anyone who says they're from me, unless I call you first. He picked up his phone. I mean that. Anyone. I know, she said. He was already moving. At the hallway entrance, he stopped. He turned. And he came back fast, 3 steps across the kitchen, and before she could recalibrate, he had his hand at her jaw again. Both hands this time. Her face held carefully, deliberately, the way you held something you were afraid of dropping. And he looked at her from close range with the open, unguarded expression that had no wall in it at all. He didn't kiss her. He just stayed there for 4 seconds with his forehead almost against hers and his hands at her face and his eyes closed, like a man memorizing something in the dark. Then he stepped back. When I come back, he said. She nodded. He left. She spent the next 3 hours in a state she would later describe to no one as the specific particular hell of waiting for someone you care about to come back from something you can't help with. She cleaned things that didn't need cleaning. She checked her phone compulsively. She made tea and didn't drink it. She sat with the medical bag on the coffee table and went through it twice, restocking, reorganizing, giving her hands something to do while her mind ran through scenarios she was trying not to run through. At noon, Caruso called. Ms. Brooks? His voice was taut. Mr. DeLuca asked me to contact you. There's a situation. Her hand tightened on the phone. Is he... He's not hurt. He's... A pause. A sound of movement in the background, voices, something that might have been a car door. He's with his father. It escalated. There was a meeting with the Marchetti people and it... Another pause. It went sideways. He needs you to stay where you are. Caruso. Her voice was flat. Tell me what happened. A longer pause. His father, Caruso said carefully, made a move that Raphael didn't anticipate. At the meeting, the voice dropped. He brought documentation on the operation, not to the Marchetti people, to someone else. We're not sure yet who. But it means that there are people with information about the DeLuca operation who shouldn't have it, and Raphael is... Caruso stopped. What is Raphael? She said. He's confronting his father, Caruso said. Right now, at the DeLuca building on Lexington. And it's... A breath. It's not going well. She stood up. What's the address? She said. Ms. Brooks, he told me specifically. Caruso. Her voice had an edge she rarely used but had available. What is the address? He gave it to her. The DeLuca building on Lexington was 12 blocks from the tower, a different kind of building, older, darker, the kind of structure that had absorbed decades of decisions without expressing an opinion about any of them. The lobby guard looked at her like she was the wrong kind of visitor, and she said Raphael DeLuca's name with a certainty that opened doors, which was a thing she was learning. She found them on the 4th floor. She heard them before she reached the room. Not the words, the sound. The specific texture of 2 men who had been holding a conversation for 30 years, finally having the version of it that contained everything they'd been leaving out. She stopped outside the half-open door. Raphael's voice. You used my people. My men. You gave the Marchetti family a timeline, and 2 of my men are in a hospital because... Vincenzo's voice, lower, even. I gave them nothing they wouldn't have found themselves. I accelerated. You accelerated it because you needed me backed into a corner. You needed me without options, so I'd agree to the restructure. I needed you to stop. Vincenzo's voice cracked, just slightly, just at the edge. I needed you to stop becoming someone who would throw this empire away for a woman you've known for 6 weeks. A silence. Then Raphael, very quiet. Say that again. You heard me. Say it again. She stepped through the door. Both men looked at her. Vincenzo's expression went through several things rapidly. Raphael's expression did one thing and stayed there. Relief, immediate and unguarded, and followed immediately by something that looked like fury on her behalf. "You need to leave," he said to his father. "We're not finished," Vincenzo said. "We are." Raphael's voice was absolutely flat. "We are completely finished. For today." He looked at his father with the expression of a man who is dismantling a structure he has lived inside for 30 years and can feel every piece coming apart in his hands. "You had no right to go to her. You had no right to use what you know about her against her. And you had no right to run a play against my operation to force my hand." His jaw was hard. The bruise from yesterday had gone deeper, darker. Whatever you think you were protecting, whatever version of me you think you built, you don't own it. Isette. Vincenzo looked at him. He looked at him for a long time, and then he looked at Elena. She met his gaze. She stood in the doorway of this room, and she looked at the man who had come to her apartment and very carefully and very precisely tried to dismantle something that mattered to her. And she felt, not anger, anger was too clean. She felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has spent their entire life being told they weren't enough for the room they were standing in. She was in this room. She was standing in it. "Mr. De Luca," she said, and her voice was level. "I want you to understand something. I heard everything you said to me yesterday. You weren't wrong about all of it." She paused. "But you made a decision about what I could survive without asking me, and that wasn't yours to make." Vincenzo looked at her. Something shifted in his face, something that had not been there yesterday, something that was not calculation. She didn't wait for him to answer. She crossed the room to Raphael. She looked at the bruise. She looked at his eyes, too bright, the specific brightness of a man running on adrenaline and grief and anger and about 3 hours of sleep over the past 2 days. She looked at him with the focused professional attention that had been her cover for 6 weeks and was not her cover anymore. "We're leaving," she said. He looked at her. "Now," she said. And behind her, Vincenzo De Luca stood in his office on Lexington Avenue and watched his son follow a quiet woman in a gray cardigan out the door. And something happened in the old man's face that had not happened in a very long time. Something that was not certainty, not calculation, not the flat machinery of a man who had decided long ago that the world worked one specific way. Something that looked briefly and painfully like doubt. Vincenzo De Luca had not experienced doubt in a long time. He had experienced setbacks, recalculations, strategic pivots, all the things that looked like doubt from the outside but were, at their core, simply the machinery of a man adjusting his approach without questioning his direction. He had not questioned his direction since 1987, when he buried his own father and took over an operation that was bleeding money and loyalty in equal measure, and rebuilt it through a combination of ruthlessness and intelligence that people in certain circles still talked about. He stood in his office on Lexington and listened to the sound of his son's footsteps moving down the hallway, and he felt, for the first time in decades, the particular discomfort of a man who has been certain about something for 30 years and is beginning to suspect the certainty was a scar rather than a foundation. He sat down in his chair. He looked at his hands. He sat there for a long time. Raphael didn't speak in the car. Elena sat beside him and didn't push it. She watched the city move past the windows, and she watched him from the corner of her eye. The set of his shoulders, the jaw, the way his hands were on his knees with the stillness of someone applying significant control to something that wanted to move. The bruise at his jaw had gone the color of a storm sky. His breathing was measured, deliberate, the specific rhythm she had taught him in the 3rd week for blood pressure management, and the fact that he was using it without being reminded told her more than anything he could have said. Back at the tower, they rode the elevator in silence. Inside the apartment, he went directly to the window, the same window he always went to when he needed to think, the Manhattan skyline doing its indifferent work below. And he stood there with his back to her and his hands loose at his sides. She went to the kitchen, made tea. The chamomile and valerian, the same thing she'd brought to the study door on the bad night in week 2. She carried it to the living room and set it on the table near him, and then sat on the couch and waited. He turned from the window after a while. He looked at the tea. He looked at her. He sat down in the armchair. "My father," he said, and then stopped. Tried again. "He's been running the Marchetti negotiation for 4 months, before my cardiac event, before you arrived." He saw the federal pressure building on the waterfront operation, and he decided that the best strategic response was to engineer a controlled merger, fold the DeLuca Eastern Corridor into the Marchetti network, and position himself as the architect of the new structure. He picked up the tea, set it down without drinking it. I was the obstacle. Not because he wants me gone, because I wouldn't agree, and he knew I wouldn't agree, and so he needed to manufacture the conditions under which I had no choice. The Benedetto leak, she said, was real. Sal was genuinely compromised, but my father knew about it before I did. He let it run because it gave him something to use. If I responded with mercy, he had proof I'd gone soft, which he could take to the Marchetti people as evidence that the operation needed new leadership. If I responded with the other thing, he paused. He had proof I was still the version of me he built, which meant the merger could proceed with me at the table in a diminished capacity. He built a situation where either answer worked for him, she said. Yes? Except you didn't do either of those things, she said. You let Sal leave and you came back here. He looked at her. What did you do, Raphael? She said. Not accusatory, just asking. I told Sal to get out of the city and I came home, he said. And 2 days later, 2 of my men were in a hospital because the Marchetti people moved on the waterfront using the schedule information from the months when Sal was still active. He looked at the tea. I don't know yet whether my father gave them the green light or whether they moved on their own. It doesn't change the result. Are your men going to be all right? She said. One will be. The other... He stopped. We don't know yet. She absorbed this. What do you need to do? She said. He looked at her with the expression that had been building all afternoon, the one with nothing managed in it, nothing performed, the raw version of a man who had spent the morning dismantling the architecture his father had built inside him and was standing in the rubble trying to figure out what to rebuild. I don't know, he said. She had never heard him say those 3 words before. She sat with them, and with him, in the quiet. The call from Caruso came at 4 in the afternoon. The second man, the one they'd been waiting on, was going to live. Broken ribs, internal bruising, a surgical repair that had taken 3 hours and had apparently been touch and go for one of them, but he was going to live. Raphael took the call standing in the hallway, and when he came back into the living room, his face had done something private and brief that she wasn't supposed to see but did. A loosening, a release, the specific expression of a man who has been braced for the worst and just learned it isn't coming. He sat back down. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. There's something I need to do tomorrow, he said, and I need to do it alone. She looked at him. My father, he said, there are things that need to be said that can't be said with anyone else in the room. He looked at her. Not because I'm protecting you from it, because it's 30 years of something private, and I need to say it without caring how it looks. She nodded. After that, he said, and his voice changed, became careful, became the voice of a man navigating unfamiliar terrain. I want to talk about the kitchen. 2 nights ago. What was happening before the phone rang? She looked at him. Not tonight, he said. Tonight I need to sleep and you need to sleep. And there's a man in a hospital in Brooklyn who's alive because 3 surgeons did their jobs, and I need a few hours to just be still with that. He looked at his hands. But tomorrow, after my father, I want to talk about it. Okay, she said. Okay, he repeated. Like the word was new. She got up. She crossed to the armchair. She stood beside it and she put her hand on his shoulder. Just her hand, just the weight of it, nothing more. And she felt him go very still beneath it, the specific stillness of someone receiving something they don't have a practiced response to. She left her hand there for a moment. Then she went to bed. He left at 9 the next morning. He came back at 1:15. She knew from the moment the elevator opened that it had happened. Whatever 30 years of private things looked like when they finally got said, it had happened, and it had cost something. He looked lighter and heavier simultaneously, which was the only way she could describe it, Like a man who had put down a weight he'd been carrying so long, his posture had built around it, and now he didn't know quite how to stand. He came and sat at the kitchen table. She put coffee in front of him. He drank half of it. He cried, he said, flat, factual, like he was still deciding what to do with it. She sat across from him. "I've never seen my father cry," he said. "I didn't know he—" He stopped. "I told him what he did to you was unacceptable, that using your loss against you as a strategic instrument was something I could not— I was very clear about it." He paused. "And he said he knew. He said it while I was still talking. He said he knew it was wrong when he did it, and he did it anyway because he was afraid." "Afraid of what?" she said quietly. "Of watching me lose something." He looked at the coffee. He said, and I'm going to say this once because I need to say it somewhere, he said that when my mother left, he came apart. Not the way he's ever let anyone see. Privately, completely. For about a year, he was not functional in the ways that mattered, and he put himself back together by deciding that what had broken him was the attachment, that the mistake was letting her matter that much. He looked up, and he spent the next 23 years making sure I never made that mistake, making sure I was built so that nothing could break me the way she broke him. The kitchen was very quiet. "He saw what was happening between us," Raphael said, "and he saw himself 30 years ago, and he panicked." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "That doesn't make it right," she said. "No," he said. "I told him that too." "What did he say?" "He said he knew." Raphael looked at the table. "He said a lot of things. About my mother. About choices he made. About—" He stopped. Breathed. "He said he's been alone for 23 years and he told himself it was strength. And lately, he's not so sure." She absorbed this. "He's not a good man," Raphael said. "I want to be clear that I understand that. What he did to the operation, to my men, the games he ran, I'm not forgiving that today. That's separate. That has a separate process." He looked at her. "But he's my father, and he sat across from me today and told me the truth for possibly the first time in my life, and I don't know what to do with that except—" He stopped. "Except hold both things," she said. He looked at her. "The truth he told you and the damage he did," she said. "You can hold both things. They don't cancel each other out." He looked at her for a long time. "How do you do that?" he said. "Hold things that contradict each other." "Practice," she said, "and deciding that needing the world to be simple is a luxury you can't always afford." He almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile. She had seen him smile exactly twice in 6 weeks, both times brief and slightly surprised, like the expression showed up without being invited. But it was the edge of one, and it changed his face in the specific way that made her understand why it was such a dangerous thing. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. Just that. Just his hand over hers, palm down, warm, deliberate. She turned her hand over. They sat like that. They talked for 2 hours. Not about the empire, not about his father, not about what happened on the waterfront. They talked about the kitchen, about what had been building for 6 weeks in the space of his apartment, in the specific geometry of 2 people who had both been alone for a long time and had managed, without quite agreeing to stop being alone inside the same 4 walls. He was not good at it. She needed to say that honestly, at least to herself. He was not practiced at this, at the direct exchange of what you actually felt rather than the managed version of it. He said things and then qualified them immediately. And she let him qualify them and then came back to the thing underneath the qualification, and he was frustrated by this at first, and then he wasn't. And they found a rhythm that was theirs, specific to them, built from 6 weeks of learning each other's silences. He told her that the morning after the terrace, he had stood in his study with the phone in his hand and understood that he was in genuine trouble. Not the operational kind, not the kind he knew how to manage, but the kind that lived below the floor of everything he'd built and could bring it down if he let it. She told him that she had stood on the sidewalk looking at the photograph and kept arriving, from every direction, at the same unwillingness to leave. He told her about his mother. The real version, not the edited one he'd given her on the couch. He'd found her at 23 through a private investigator he'd hired and never told his father about. She was in Milan, remarried, 2 younger children, a life that had been built entirely on the other side of the ocean from the one she'd left. He had flown there, stood outside her building for 40 minutes, gone back to his hotel, and taken the first flight home and never told anyone. She looked at him while he told her this. She did not try to fix it or resolve it or put it in a frame that made it easier. She just looked at him with the steady, honest attention that had been the most disorienting thing about her from the first day. And he talked until he was done talking, and then he was quiet. "You never went back," she said. "No." "Do you wish you had?" He thought about it seriously. "I don't know," he said. "Some days." She nodded. Then she told him about Clara. Not the clinical version, not the version designed to be bearable for a listener, the real one. The name she'd chosen in the second month, the way she'd painted a room in the apartment she'd shared with her husband, a soft yellow, before she knew about the infidelity, before the marriage broke, when she had still believed she was building something. The way she'd had to leave that apartment and couldn't take the color of the room with her, but also couldn't stop seeing it. He listened without moving. When she finished, he was very still. "Yellow," he said. "Yellow," she said. He looked at her. His jaw was working with something he was deciding whether to say. "The second bedroom here," he said. "I've had it empty since I moved in. The architect wanted to put a home office in it. I said no." He paused. "I never understood why I said no. I just didn't want an office in there." She looked at him. "I think," he said carefully, "that room has been waiting for something. I couldn't tell you what, but something." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know that. Whatever you decide about this, about us, I want you to know that I have not been this honest with a living person since I was 9 years old, and it is not comfortable. I am profoundly uncomfortable." He paused. "But I would rather be uncomfortable and honest with you than comfortable and managed without you." She looked at him for a long moment. "Rafael De Luca," she said. "Yes, I am not going to fix you. I know. And you cannot fix me. I know that too. And there are parts of your life that I don't understand and will never be equipped for, and that is not going to change." "No," he said. "It isn't." He looked at her. "But I am. There are things I'm going to change. Not because you asked me to, because standing in that office today, watching my father sit across from me as a lonely 64-year-old man who decided strength meant being alone, I understood something I've understood intellectually for years and never felt before." He paused. "I do not want to be that at 64. She looked at him. "The waterfront operation," he said, "is going to be restructured, legitimately, or shed. The Marchetti situation is going to be handled by lawyers, not the other way. It's going to take time and it's going to be messy." He held her gaze. "But I am not going to sit across from my child someday and tell them that I chose the empire over the life." The word, child, landed in the room. She felt it in her sternum. She looked at him. He looked back at her, steady and direct and profoundly uncomfortable and present, entirely present, more present than she had ever seen another person be in a room. She reached across the table. She covered his hand the way he had covered hers. He exhaled. It was the exhale of a man who has been holding his breath for 32 years, and it was not dramatic. It was just air leaving a body that had been keeping it too long. The Marchetti situation took 4 months. It was handled, as Raphael had said it would be, with lawyers and leverage and a lengthy federal cooperation arrangement that Raphael entered through an intermediary and that cost him significant portions of the waterfront operation and 2 years of uncomfortable proximity to people he would have preferred never to speak to again. There was nothing clean about it and nothing easy, and there were weeks during those 4 months when he came home looking like a man who had been through something, and Elena made soup, and they sat at the kitchen table, and she let him be exactly as present or absent as he needed to be. Vincenzo was not prosecuted. There was a separate negotiation for that, a different kind of cost, and Raphael paid it without discussing it with anyone except Caruso, and then, briefly, with Elena. Not the details, never the details, but the weight of it, the specific moral weight of paying a price to keep a man safe who had done damage, and whether that made him weak or whether it made him a son. She said it made him both. He could hold both. He smiled. The real one, the full one, which she had now seen 6 times and was still slightly surprised by each time it appeared. Vincenzo moved to a smaller apartment in the building on Lexington. He reduced his active involvement in what remained of the operation. He and Raphael began having dinner on the first Sunday of each month, which was not comfortable and was not warm and was not repaired exactly, but was present. Two men choosing to be in the same room and try, which was more than there had been before. Elena went back to work, part-time initially, then full, cardiac care at Lenox Hill. The wards she knew. The work that had always made sense to her in the specific way that some work makes sense because it is where your particular shape fits. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. Raphael learned to cook two things, eggs and soup. The eggs were adequate. The soup was, he felt, approaching Elena's standard, which she told him with the straight face of a professional was technically incorrect, but she appreciated the commitment. He was better at sleeping. Not good. He suspected he would never be good at sleeping. It was structural. The architecture of a man built for watchfulness, but better. She had kept the blackout curtains. She had kept the humidifier. The apartment had, over the months, accumulated small signs of two people living in it rather than one man managing an existence inside it, and he had not planned any of it, but none of it felt wrong. They were married in October, a small ceremony, small by the standards of a man whose name carried the weight that Raphael's carried, which meant it was still larger than either of them wanted, but was managed down to something that felt real. 8 people. The ceremony was in the apartment, the terrace actually, which was either poetic or predictable depending on how you felt about the significance of terraces. Caruso cried. Nobody mentioned this. Vincenzo came. He sat in the second row, and he watched his son marry a quiet woman in a dark dress, and at a certain point during the vows, his face did the thing it had done in the office on Lexington. The thing that was not certainty, not calculation. And he looked down at his hands in his lap and stayed that way for a while. After, when the small gathering had moved inside, he found Elena near the window. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I want to say something to you," he said. "All right," she said. "I handled it wrong," he said. "What I did? Coming to you." He held her gaze. "I came to you with information designed to make you afraid, and I framed it as concern. That was manipulative." He paused. "I've been manipulative for so long it has become the vocabulary I use for everything. I don't always know anymore when I'm doing it." A pause. "That's not an excuse." She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "It isn't." He nodded. "But I hear it," she said. "What you said. And I believe you meant it." He looked at her with those calculating eyes. Except the calculation was gone right now. Just this moment. Just 2 people standing at a window in October. "He's different," Vincenzo said. "Raphael. I built him to be a specific thing, and he is still that thing. He will always have that in him, but he's also—" He stopped. "He laughs now, quietly, rarely, but he laughs." Elena looked at him. "I don't think he laughed once in the 5 years before you arrived," Vincenzo said. "I didn't realize until I saw it happen." She turned and looked through the room to where Raphael was, across the apartment, talking to Caruso, and even from here she could see the specific set of his body that meant he was relaxed, genuinely relaxed, the shoulders down, the jaw unclenched, the quality of presence that had been building for 5 months and still occasionally surprised her with how total it was. "He's working on it," she said. "I know," Vincenzo said. "I can see that." They stood in silence for a moment. "I don't know how to be a father to him," Vincenzo said. "I know how to build men. I don't know how to—" He stopped. "I'm 64 years old, and I'm learning something I should have known at 30. Elena looked at him. "He has dinner with you," she said. "First Sunday of the month. Shows up." She paused. "That's not nothing." Vincenzo looked at her. Something in his face that was older than the calculation, something that had been there long before the machinery had built up around it. "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." The night of the wedding, after everyone had left and the apartment was theirs again, they stood on the terrace. October had gone cold and clear, the kind of night the city occasionally produced as if to remind people it was capable of beauty when it wanted to be. Below, the lights pressed against the dark in every direction. Above, enough stars to count if you wanted to, which neither of them did. Elena had taken off her shoes somewhere around 10 o'clock. She was standing at the railing in bare feet on the cold stone, which he had noticed and mentioned and she had ignored, which was standard. He stood beside her, close enough that their arms were touching. The city moved below, indifferent, relentless, incapable of marking the occasion. He had always liked that about it, actually. The city's absolute refusal to acknowledge individual significance. It had felt like company once, that indifference, a world that didn't require anything from him. It felt different now. Now it felt like backdrop. He looked at her profile, the set of her face in the dark, that careful quality, the guardedness that had been there in the photograph from her ID and was still there, would probably always be there, because it was structural for her the way control was structural for him. But the thing underneath it, the thing that had been surfacing gradually for 5 months, the warmth and the directness and the specific courage of a woman who had rebuilt herself twice and still had the capacity to reach toward something that was completely visible right now. She felt him looking. She turned. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She looked at him with that expression, the steady, seeing one. "You're doing the thing," she said. "What thing?" "Where you look at me like you're memorizing something." He looked at her. "I do that," he said. "I know you do." "Is it a problem?" She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "I just like knowing when you're doing it." He turned back to the city. She leaned slightly into him, not dramatically, not a performance of closeness, just a small shift of weight, her shoulder against his arm. He lifted his arm and put it around her. She was cold. Her feet especially, through the thin material of her dress to the stone of the terrace. He could feel the cold of it against his side. He thought about telling her to go inside and knew she would tell him she was fine, and he decided not to bother with the exchange. They stood there. The city moved. He thought about Sal Benedetto, who he had heard was living in Florida now, quiet, his daughter still at Fordham, his wife sending him photographs of the coast. He thought about the 2 men from the waterfront, one of whom had sent him a card from the hospital that was still somewhere in the study, a strange, halting thing that had clearly cost something to write. He thought about his mother in Milan, in a life he had not tried again to see. He thought about his father eating Sunday dinner across a table from him in a restaurant on the Upper West Side, learning, at 64, how to talk to his son about something other than strategy. He thought about the room in the apartment that had been waiting. He had not told Elena yet that he'd painted it. Soft yellow. He had done it himself, badly, requiring 3 coats and a conversation with a hardware store employee that was the most domestically disorienting 30 minutes of his adult life. It was not perfect. There were places near the baseboard where the line wasn't clean. He was going to tell her tomorrow. Or tonight, maybe. She shifted against him, and he looked down at her, and she looked up at him. And for a moment, neither of them said anything. And then she said, "I'm glad I stayed." He looked at her. "I know," he said. She turned back to the city. He held her in the cold and felt in his chest the organ that had given out on a Tuesday night in October and been rebuilt, slowly, imperfectly, not all the way back, but further than anyone had a right to expect, beating with the particular reliability of something that had been through the worst of itself and found a reason on the other side. Not perfectly, not without cost, but present. Entirely, stubbornly, irreversibly present. The city moved below them, indifferent and enormous, and in the spring she would come to him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning and show him a test, and his face would do something it had never done before, something open and unguarded and completely unpracticed, something that started in his chest and reached all the way up, and she would stand in the kitchen in the morning light and watch the most feared man on the East Coast learn, for the first time in his life, what it felt like to be found. But that was spring. Tonight was October. Tonight was enough.